The UN Security Council condemnation of North Korea's long-range missile launch was blocked by Russia. Moscow's UN envoy took issue over the wording of the statement, saying there's insufficient evidence to classify Pyongyang's latest missile as an ICBM.
The UN Security Council has failed to release a press statement condemning North Korea after Russia opposed the adoption and claimed the missile launched by Pyongyang on Tuesday was not an ICBM. Vladimir Safrankov, Moscow's deputy ambassador to the UN, said data collected by Russia's military indicates the missile was in fact an intermediate-range ballistic missile.
According to the information from the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, based on the objective and technology-based monitoring of the situation, it has been established that the parameters and data regarding the target of the missile are in line with the tactical criteria of mid-range ballistic missiles.
Security Council statements must have the approval of all 15 members, and Russia said it had proposed amendments to the current draft. U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley blasted Russia over its reluctance to admit that North Korea had launched an ICBM when the rest of the world has already recognized it as fact.
The United States has rejected a joint proposal by China and Russia to ease tensions on the Korean peninsula through mutual de-escalation by both sides. The plan had called for a suspension of both Pyongyang's weapons programs and joint military drills between Washington and Seoul. However, State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert said on Thursday there are no parallels between U.S. military exercises and North Korea's weapons development. She added the U.S. believes China can do much more to increase pressure on North Korea and will continue to urge Beijing to do so.
We're at the Summit Media Center. This is where all G20 news reports are born. If you want to know what and who's going to grab most media attention at the summit, I'll teach you a trick. Just look at some of the pictures around you. For instance, on the papers that you can find at TV live positions, like this one. The most important things that you will be looking out for at this summit?
Well, the most important.
Putin-Trump meeting. That's one of the most important meetings of the entire summit.
It will be the first face-to-face meeting here.
I think everyone else is going to be holding their breath.
It will be, it's like a wage. It will be like a fight of power.
Don't call it meeting. It's really summit within a summit.
Their slogan, "Welcome to Hell." Hundreds of black-clad anti-capitalist protesters wreaked havoc in the German city of Hamburg before the G20 summit. Around 75 police officers were injured in the clashes, which went on until midnight. The protesters say gatherings of the world's richest countries have so far failed to solve the key issues threatening world peace. Several cars were torched and shop windows smashed. Police dispersed the mobs with water cannons and pepper spray. Authorities expect 100,000 people from around Europe to join demonstrations against the summit, and around 8,000 are thought to be ready to commit violence.
UNESCO has passed yet another resolution condemning Israeli presence in the Old City in East Jerusalem, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry is outraged.
Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah party is calling the resolution a form of historic justice. Meanwhile, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, however, is expressing contempt for the bizarre and irrelevant decision. The Foreign Ministry's statement says that, quote, UNESCO is acting on behalf of the enemies of history and the truth. It is sad, unnecessary, and pathetic, end quote. The statement also makes special effort to note that the resolution in question failed to get a majority of votes. UNESCO is set to vote on another controversial resolution about the old city of Hebron soon, and the Israeli government has already been equally forceful in rejecting the legitimacy of the UN organization's initiative there. Just last weekend, during a two-day UN panel on the Israeli occupation, Israeli ambassador to the UN Dani Danon called for UNESCO and any other anti-Israel UN body to be dissolved.
UNESCO has voted to make the Tomb of Patriarchs in Hebron an endangered Palestinian site on Friday. The decision comes out of a World Heritage Committee meeting in Krakow. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin said the Palestinian-led motion is, quote, intent on sprouting anti-Jewish lies, while it remains silent as the region's heritage is destroyed by brutal extremists. This is the second time this week UNESCO has angered Israel. The Hebron vote comes after a separate resolution was passed 3 days ago denouncing Israeli activity in Jerusalem's Old City.
The French President Emmanuel Macron met with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas yesterday, and he has some strong criticism for Israeli colonialism. The two leaders met at the Elysee Palace in France, where they signed an agreement to establish a French-language high school in the Palestinian capital of Ramallah and agreed to organize a joint seminar over the next few months. Macron had some scathing words for Israel.
La France a toujours condamné et condamne la poursuite de la colonisation, qui est illégale au regard du droit international.
This is the first time that Macron has publicly spoken about his approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, although he has been opposed to unilaterally recognizing a Palestinian state. The French leader is widely seen as more pro-Israel than his predecessor François Hollande and has publicly taken a strong stance against BDS. France has held a pro-Arab line since the 1960s, when then-leader Charles de Gaulle canceled arms sales to Israel and imposed an arms embargo. In 1969, Israeli naval commandos sailed several naval boats out of a French harbor that Israel had paid for and France had refused to deliver. In 2016, France voted for a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlements, including in Jerusalem.
Hungarian Jews said on Thursday that Prime Minister Viktor Orban's billboard campaign against migration and foreign influence, using the image of U.S. financier George Soros, was a proxy for anti-Semitism. They urged the nationalist Orban to halt the campaign. Orban's spokesperson said the campaign had nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but rather sought to only counter what he called Soros's attempts to unduly change immigration policies in Hungary. Around 100,000 Jewish people live in the country.
EU interior ministers have refused to support an Italian proposal to open up European ports to ships carrying migrants. But governments, however, did agree to help the Libyan coast guards do more and step up deportations of failed asylum seekers. Italy had sought help, even at one point threatening to close its ports to foreign humanitarian ships.
Something like the deal between the European Union and Turkey, or the agreements that we have with Morocco, would not be replicable in Libya. We do not really have any sufficiently reliable state partner. If Libya was really able and willing to cooperate against smugglers, they would not even let those boats go at sea in the first place.
The operation began early Friday morning. Dozens of police were brought in and did their best to control the crowds.
Please, I ask you, don't push, okay? We're going to begin.
The task for the authorities was a familiar one, to clear an overcrowded temporary welcome centre for migrants. It's the 34th such operation in the Greater Paris region in the past 2 years. The site at Porte de la Chapelle in the capital's 18th arrondissement, which opened just last year, was designed to house around 500 migrants for 5 to 10 days. But numbers have soared, especially since the closure of the Calais jungle camp last year, and many have been staying in tents in an unofficial overflow area.
We've begun an operation to shelter migrants who live in degrading conditions, both for their safety and for their health.
Nearly 2,800 migrants, mainly from Africa and the Middle East, were moved in the operation. They were taken on buses to a range of reception centres across the Greater Paris region of Île-de-France. Officials say the reception centres, as well as providing food and lodging, will offer access to medical care and immigration officials to give advice on the asylum process. But with such large numbers at play, pressure is growing on the authorities to come up with a solution. Paris's mayor, Anne Hidalgo, wants a new law with measures to accommodate the migrant flow and provide better humanitarian conditions.
The European Parliament has asked for Turkey's EU accession talks to be suspended if the country implements a constitutional overhaul, which expands the powers of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. EU leaders have been critical of Erdogan and his behavior toward opponents, both before and after last year's abortive coup. Opposition parties and human rights groups say the reforms threaten judicial independence and push Turkey towards one-man rule. However, Turkey rejects the request by the European Parliament, calling it an attempt to sabotage its relations with the EU.
We call the report of the European Parliament, like we have been calling it for the past 2 years, as void and invalid. We will send the report back without any evaluation as soon as it arrives on our side.
Turkish police have detained 10 people, including the local director of Amnesty International, in a raid the NGO called a grotesque abuse of power. No reason was given for the arrests. Idil Ezer was attending a meeting south of Istanbul when he and other human rights activists were taken to police stations across the city on Wednesday evening, their lawyer says. They decided to detain them and to ban lawyers' visits. We couldn't get any information. The order continues. Today we learned that they extended the period of detention for another 7 days. We were not told why they're detained. The chairman of Amnesty's Turkey branch has been detained since last month over alleged links to the network of Muslim cleric Fethullah Gulen, whom the government blames for last year's failed coup. EU Enlargement Commissioner Johannes Hahn was in Turkey to discuss EU accession talks. He said he had raised the matter with Turkish officials and did not get enough answers, but would keep chasing them.
The 4 Arab states leading the boycott against Qatar say its refusal to meet their demands represents a threat to regional security. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt and Bahrain are now pledging new political, economic and legal steps against Doha. The rifts worrying Washington.
We remain very concerned about that ongoing situation involving Qatar and GCC countries. We've become increasingly concerned that that dispute is at an impasse at this point. We believe that this could potentially drag on for weeks. It could drag on for months. It could possibly even intensify.
A member of the GCC or Gulf Cooperation Council trading bloc, Qatar could now be forced out. Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, is due in the region next week.
Qataris are feeling galvanized after Egypt and Arab neighbors imposed sanctions on the country. The other countries have also cut ties with Qatar and accused the nation of supporting militants. Doha denies the charges, and there are no signs the standoff will spiral into military confrontation. The crisis has bolstered nationalist support for the 37-year-old ruler of the world's wealthiest country per capita. Local media said that hundreds of men are already signing up for the military to support Qatar.
The thing I want to show you here are the holes in the walls on the left and the right-hand side. So if we look over there, you can see a pretty distinct hole over there that's been bashed through the wall, easily enough space for a man. And then over on the other side, leading through to the neighbour's house, it's now been blocked off, but you can again see another hole there. Can you ask the ladies why they did this? Why were these holes made?
They make us do this on purpose. They just come to draw on the wall so they can use it as a cover from the airstrike to go in and out.
What would have happened if you hadn't made those holes that they drew on the wall?
They will blow at the house.
Or they'll kill the people inside. And we've heard this story repeatedly from people that they were ordered to do things by ISIS. Interestingly, the house that they fled to over the road was then occupied by ISIS and they had to look after them. And these stories are repeated time and time again throughout this whole neighborhood, throughout this whole city.
A major prison riot broke out in the major Mexican city of Acapulco, killing at least 28 inmates. According to a state security official, the fight broke out between rival gangs in the maximum security wing of the prison, leaving bodies scattered throughout the wing, including in the kitchen and areas for conjugal visits. It was one of the worst outbreaks of violence in Mexican jails in recent years as the country endures one of its bloodiest years in modern history with intensified gang warfare.
Reuters has reported that a prominent Muslim group in Malaysia has joined calls by Islamic conservatives in Indonesia for a boycott of Starbucks to protest against the international coffee chain's support of gay rights. Activists say intolerance of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender or LGBT people has spiked in recent years in Indonesia and Malaysia, both majority Muslim, multi-ethnic Southeast Asian countries. Perkasa, a group with about 700,000 members that campaigns for the rights of ethnic Malay Muslims, said it agrees with calls this week by Muhammadiyah, Indonesia's second largest Muslim group, for a boycott of Starbucks over its pro-LGBT stand.
A Canadian baby was given a health card without an assigned gender identity. The Christian Post reports this is the world's first gender-free child. Evangelist Franklin Graham calls the parents' decision, quote, nonsense. The parents claim giving their child a specific gender is a human rights violation. Graham responded in a Facebook post Wednesday saying, this Canadian parent believes that assigning a child's sex at birth is a human rights violation, and they wanted their baby to be registered as gender unknown so they can decide their own sex. That's nonsense. The child's parents identifies as non-binary gender, queer, trans person. Democrats in Oregon have passed a bill requiring health insurers to pay for abortions for residents and illegal immigrants. The new bill essentially makes the procedure free, and it covers abortion for virtually any reason, even late-term and sex selection abortions. Health insurers would have to provide free abortions to all patients without a copay. Republican lawmakers tried to block the bill, but did not have enough votes. It does provide an exemption for churches and religious nonprofit organizations.
There's a warning from the World Health Organization that antibiotic resistance could make gonorrhea almost impossible to treat. Doctors say the sexually transmitted bacteria has become particularly clever, quickly evolving to outsmart all known drugs used to fight them. So-called super gonorrhea is now increasingly being reported, and there's widespread resistance to older and cheaper antibiotics. The crisis will be discussed at a conference in Rio de Janeiro this week, with calls for urgent research into new drugs and a vaccination.
Amid measles outbreaks and drops in vaccinations, the French government is making more vaccines mandatory. French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe recently said young children will have to get 8 new vaccines starting next year. Vaccines for diphtheria, tetanus, and polio are already a must in France. 8 more, which state health authorities already recommend, will be added to that list in 2018. Many French doctors support these mandatory vaccinations. Back in June, 200 doctors and hospital administrators publicly petitioned for the new policy. In his announcement, the Prime Minister said, quote, diseases that we believe to be eradicated are developing once again. He referenced the European measles outbreak, which has killed 10 children in France since 2008. The World Health Organization says the disease is rapidly spreading throughout Europe because of drops in immunization coverage. France's new policy follows in the footsteps of Italy's. In May, Italy's government said children must be vaccinated for 12 diseases before they can enroll in public school. The country's health minister hopes the mandate will send a, quote, strong message to the public about the importance of vaccines.
Health officials in Mississippi confirmed a new case of West Nile virus on Wednesday in what is considered to be the peak season for possible infection, according to the CDC. This is the second case for the state this year. The Mississippi State Department of Health releasing a statement saying, quote, while West Nile virus can occur at any time of the year, we are now in peak season when most cases occur. Additionally, we continue to identify mosquitoes from many areas in the state that have tested positive for West Nile. So now is the time to really take precautions to avoid mosquito bites when going outdoors. The virus can cause encephalitis or meningitis, which could lead to paralysis, coma, or death. The CDC recommends the following tips to prevent mosquito bites. Use insect repellent with DEET. Wear loose-fitting clothes that cover arms and legs. Eliminate sources of stagnant water around homes and use screens to protect windows and doors. There were 2,038 cases of West Nile virus last year that contributed to the deaths of 94 people, according to the CDC.
There's some good news out of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Opioid prescriptions fell for the first time since the epidemic began. The amount of opioids prescribed hit its peak in 2010 and fell by 18% by 2015. The CDC only has numbers through 2015, so it's unclear if rates have risen since then. The data also showed that opioid prescription rates in 2015 were triple the 1999 rate. That means there's still a long way to go. Every year, tens of thousands of people in the US die from opioid-related drug overdoses. An estimated 2 million Americans had an opioid addiction in 2015. People were also being prescribed the drugs for longer periods of time at higher dosages, giving patients more of a chance to become addicted. And when prescriptions end, some people move on to stronger illegal drugs. The death rate from heroin and fentanyl has increased a lot faster than death rates from prescription narcotics. The report is still a reason for some optimism. The new data suggests that at least some doctors have gotten the message to cut down on opioid prescriptions.
As the sun rises, Joyce Muthanya begins her journey across the arid plains to where she and her granddaughter collect water for the day. It's dirty, but there's no other option. The family would usually rely on maize for food and income, but the rains haven't come, so they've turned to this versatile crop instead.
You're lucky boy. In the past, we used to depend on maize in this area instead of sorghum, but now maize is not growing and we are looking to increase our sorghum production. It is doing better both for sale and for domestic consumption.
They've been helped by an aid organisation which promotes crops that tolerate drought. But with 2.7 million Kenyans in need of food, many more need help. People in Kenya, Somalia and Ethiopia are all suffering the effects of this drought, compounded by 2 years of below-average rainfall. It means those who, unlike Joyce, don't have access to resistant crops are suffering.
Those harvests have been lost, and that obviously affects food prices in the market. So the cereal prices go up, the livestock prices go down, and so people who have livestock as their resource aren't getting the money that they need from that, and then have a lot of trouble affording to buy any other kind of food because those prices have risen. So it's a really dangerous kind of mix of things.
Resources of every kind become more valuable by the day when you're at nature's mercy.
Officials in Japan have now raised the death toll in the really bad flooding that's been going on there to 6 people, with still many more missing. They're thinking about 20 people are still unaccounted for in southern parts of the country. Crews were finally able to search some of those villages that had been cut off by the rain, and they ended up saving more than a dozen stranded people. But the focus now would be reaching some of those more remote areas where hundreds of people are still trapped. Heavy mud from landslides and the high water that's just continued to be a problem, of course, making rescues very difficult. Some 12,000 Japanese troops and rescue workers have joined in search and recovery efforts. And adding to the concern is the fact that there's more flooding in the forecast for eastern parts of Japan. So this storm system that produced some really nasty storms in the upper Midwest yesterday is now trudging on toward the east. You can see some of that video out of Wisconsin, Ohio. We had a couple reports of some serious straight-line wind. A couple reports I saw of, I think, 88 miles an hour and 91 mile an hour wind gusts in western Michigan after some of those storms got across Lake Michigan last night. So this storm system has a history of pretty big hail and damaging wind. It does not have a very big tornado history, but there's still at least a small chance you could see a tornado or two. Still, I'd be more worried about the damaging wind and hail. So basically what'll happen is this afternoon the storms fire up. They'll move from west to east. You can see kind of a linear mode in general with the storms, meaning they kind of set up in a linear shape, and that usually means that damaging wind is going to be the #1 threat. By the way, some of these spots have had a lot of rain over the last couple of days from just pop-up showers and storms. So if you do get caught under some heavier showers and storms, don't be surprised to see some flooding issues as well.
Sometimes you just have to use what you got, and these cops had Cheetos. Animal control officials say they use snacks to lure a family of pigs out of someone's lawn. The mama and her babies had escaped a barn about a mile away. When officials showed up to reel in the pigs, all they had on hand were Cheetos and Doritos. Animal control enticed the piglets into a patrol vehicle using the snacks, but at 600 pounds, the mama pig was too big. One officer drove the little ones back home, while another used the salty snacks to encourage the mother to hoof it back. In this town, there's never a boring day.